Guy McPherson again with Neil, and we are going deeper than we have before into deep time. And by deep time, we mean going back a very long way in history to prehistory. Before we get started, I would like to dedicate this episode to the man primarily responsible for my life as a scientist. Henry Albert Wright was born June 1st, 1935 in Modesto, California. He died October 23rd, 1993 in Lubbock, Texas, so he only lived a little over 58 years. He was a Horn professor, the Texas Tech University equivalent of a Regents professor. He was chair of the Department of Range, Wildlife, and Fishery Science for about a decade, including the entire time that I was a graduate student at Texas Tech. Henry was my major professor during my MS and PhD degrees at Texas Tech. He was renowned for his research, teaching, and writing about fire ecology and prescribed fires. I became well acquainted with his work when I was an undergraduate student majoring in forest science at the University of Idaho. My undergraduate advisor, Professor Leon Neuenschwander, had received his PhD with Henry, so we had access to Professor Wright's book, Fire Ecology, before it was published in 1982. I took my first sabbatical leave during the 1995-1996 academic year at the University of California, Berkeley. I remember having a conversation with my host about Professor Wright as a department chair. My host mentioned with surprise that Professor Wright was renowned for his fairness as department chair. My host thought that fairness was one of several approaches one could take as a department chair. He was surprised when fairness was implemented by anyone on a university campus, and he was impressed by Professor Wright's approach. Professor Wright experienced renal failure, kidney failure, before I met him. He was told by his medical practitioners that he had only a few months to live. He was also told he could have no more children. He promptly fathered his fourth child. He lived many more years, largely because he took a scientific approach to his own health. For example, after one visit to a clinic for dialysis, Professor Wright knew there must be a better way. Everyone in the clinic was hooked up to a dialysis machine with identical settings. Professor Wright knew that he sometimes ate well, other times he ate poorly. He purchased a dialysis machine so that he could adjust the settings according to his recent habits with respect to food consumption and exercise. Professor Wright knew with great certainty when he would die. He planned accordingly. To save members of his family the chores and emotional anguish, he selected his coffin, his clothes, and everything else associated with the funeral. He joked with his barber to do a good job because this was his last haircut. He also selected his pallbearers, including me. Professor Wright's funeral is the only one I've attended as a pallbearer. And with that, we'll get into an even deeper version of deep time than we've done so far. Again, I'd like to introduce Neil, and we are going to cover part 3 and maybe a little more of Rocks for Jocks. So, Neil, would you like to get us started? We have the first slide shown on the screen.
Thank you, Guy. And I think that was a very appropriate and moving dedication to yet another great teacher of yours and contributor and scientist. Let's move right along. You know, the theme here is we're charting the carbon pulse of hydrocarbon man. And I think we're going to try and cover the period 1860 to 1920 in this. That's a lot. And the theme is from whale oil to ancient liquid sunshine. And with that, let's go to our first slide. I like to start with, I think it's Robert Crumb's slide. We are all about the deep time, digging up what was laid down in the Carboniferous period, which is roughly between the Devonian and the Mississippian in this chart. And there is evidence of oil being laid down at later periods, I think, between the Permian and the Triassic and the Triassic and the Jurassic. But it's all very old fossilized mats of ancient dead algae and protozoa and other microorganisms that, that proliferated may have exploded, may have indeed taken over the ocean in large anoxic events and then settled to the bottom. We don't really know that, but we find the oil, and it is in the same locations as other fossil organic material. So let's go to the first slide after this. Again, another illustration of how oil forms and where it's found. It's usually found in the presence of natural gas, which is obviously above it. And there is usually, the reason it's there is it's trapped by an impermeable layer, which is the layer above it. Let's keep going. Now, the history of humans using something like an oil for a fuel or lighting goes quite far back. And believe it or not, dead birds, certain species of dead birds, which were oily enough, and a couple species of fish were literally dried. The oils, of course, the wonderful thing about our chemistry here on Earth and living things is the first thing that comes out of a dead animal is the moisture, and it leaves the oils. And certain species of fish can literally be used as a lantern. I think menhaden and mackerel, and there's a couple of other oily fish. And in this case, a storm petrel is tarred, has a tarred wick rammed through it, and is dried out and used as a candle. So humans will do anything, including burning fish and birds, so that they can have some light after dark. We are mimicking the fact that the sun shines brightly upon us. We apparently are covetous of that light. We desire some kind of light even at night. We have more and more activities that we do at night. We invented movable type and the printing press around about, I don't know, 1500, somewhere in there with Gutenberg. We like to read shit. We like to play and do things after dark. And firelight from wood is not enough. We obviously need candles. Candles require a lot of boiling down of animal fats and wax, but this is another way. It's literally lighting animals on fire. Next slide. But the biggest animal that we've ever lit on fire is, of course, whales. And whale oil was our lighting oil in the 1800s, and there's some 1700s, 1800s, till about the mid 1800s. This was how we lit our lamps indoors. And we hunted whales to near extinction and mostly did not use their meat. We just would go out and harpoon them, drag these huge marine mammals to the side of the boat and literally start stripping off the thick mats of blubber and haul that aboard, mainly for the fat, mainly just to burn it for lamplight. We killed these animals. Oh, and also a little cosmetics and perfume was made from the certain fats in their bodies. Next slide.
We'll do anything to light ourselves so we can see our makeup.
So that we can bask in the light, we will burn anything, hunt any animal, dig up anything. This is whalers boiling the blubber right on the ship deck. The animal probably was still living as its fat was cut off, and it might have even still been living as its fat was being burned. We don't know. This is 1874. This is when the drawing was made. Next. So this is some cans of whale oil, sperm oil, sewing machine oil. It was used also as a lubricant for bicycles. We did not have WD-40 at this point. That came later. Oils for general purposes, they were cosmetic. We already see that oils had already, since ancient Egypt, had been a cosmetic, a medicine, lamp oil, and merely getting lamp oil and oils from plants. I don't know. I'd have to get an organic chemist, but they will burn, but they're not as readily they don't burn as readily as oils. Different oils have different characteristics, and apparently whale oil was very good for all of these kinds of purposes. Next slide. Now, here is a chart of the national whaling output annual averages. And you can just look at the dates and see that something's going on. The peak of whale oil was in the 1850s. And it really mounted up from the 1816 to the 1850s. So there was a good 50 years of basically exploiting the oceans and these huge, beautiful marine mammals just for their fat. And then something seems to happen. It's actually quite a fall off from about 57 to 66. That is a precipitous fall. That's almost a Seneca cliff of some kind. And then it kind of dribbles out here to the 1890s and goes back down to where it was really at the start, a marginal usage, probably only cosmetics. We don't know. So what is it that happened? Let's go to the next slide. This is just a note here that the whales, I have not yet seen a statement that a whale species was hunted to absolute extinction. But the North Atlantic right whale, which was very commonly hunted, there are only 350 left today. And there are none in European waters, and there used to be all over. So they are still at near extinction, many of the species that were hunted. You reach a point where it's functionally extinct, as we did with the white rhino almost 15 years ago. There were only 3 left, or 4 breeding pairs in captivity. There was no wild animals. That's extinct. Am I correct?
Yes, that's absolutely right. So either when an organism runs out of habitat or when it runs out of the ability to procreate, those are the 2 factors that commit a species to functional extinction. And with this few number of right whales, it's very, very difficult for them to find each other, to create a community that allows for their continued existence. The genetics
And that's if there's no further. That's if there's no further challenges such as pollution. Something happens to their food supply. The ocean heats too much, and the little critters that they eat are just not available. I mean, there's about 40 different things that we're doing other than harpooning them that is going to damage them. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely right. The krill that they feed on
Krill, that's right.
in precipitous decline.
So I had to put that in there just to show, how much they were hunted to extinction. This is another chart. U.S. whale oil and sperm oil imports in 1805 to 1905. So there was still some. It really trails out to almost, there's still some hunting. And of course, we don't want to talk about Russian and Japanese whale hunting, which I think continues. We can't even get into 20th century whale hunting. But this is 19th century whale hunting had pretty much was just petering out there in the last few years. But a huge spike. It reaches its peak and immediately falls. The modern history of oil and gas industry started in 1847 with a discovery made by a Scottish chemist, James Young, observed that natural petroleum seepages in the Riddings coal mine, and from this seepage he distilled both a thin oil and a thicker oil suitable for lubrication. So the first efforts to refine fossil oil actually came out of a coal mine, and that's not uncommon. And he actually got 2 grades of useful oil, one for burning in lamps and one for lubrication. A year before that, in Canada, Abraham Gesner refined a liquid from coal, oil, shale, and bitumen, which is in the Canadian Shield, is the tar sands. Another word for that is bitumen. It's that super thick stuff. And he managed to refine that and really found a process for turning it into a consistent grade called kerosene, and founded the Kerosene Light Company. At the same time, in Poland, I want to give credit to all of the claimants to the modern burnable lamp oil. Polish engineer Ignacy Lukasiewicz improved on Gessner's method to more easily distill kerosene into petroleum, opening the first rock oil mine in Borbka, Poland in 1854. The first modern oil well was actually drilled in the town of La Brea, Trinidad in 1857 by the American Merrimack Company. So it just seems that in the 1840s to the 1860s, with probably the price of whale oil going up, even though the volume of it, something was happening. They were finding there was a multiple smart or canny or savvy, conniving humans were figuring out other oils to burn. Let's go to the next slide. And so Abraham Gessner here patents a process for generating kerosene, and the kerosene and oil age is launched. And oil from the ground, in other words, fossil oil or oil burnt lamp oil from crude oil, begins to take over. Next slide. Let's just look. I found this. This is the price of whale oil per gallon in 1846 was $1.50. The price per gallon of refined kerosene in 1846 was 10 cents. This is, shall we say, a little bit competitive, and it may account for why we saw whale oil drop off. I think this is the only thing that saved the whales from absolute extinctification. Is yippee, we saved the whales. How did we save the whales, Guy? We saved them with fossil fuel, oil, and kerosene. Shall we celebrate?
Oh, yes, this is clearly something to celebrate.
I mean, you realize, I mean, there are many other, you can find, our viewers can find many other histories of oil. There's a PBS series called The Prize, based on the 880-page telephone book thick, Don't Drop It on Your Foot or You'll Go to the Doctor, Daniel Yergin History of Oil. And he's an eminent oil scientist and economist who has written about oil, and actually a really nice guy, Daniel Yergin. But if you drop his book on your foot, you might actually have to go to the doctor. So you can see the documentary written based on his book, and there's about 15 or 20 other things freely available on YouTube that would give you much deeper history than I'm going here. What I want to emphasize here with Dr. Guy is the environmental impact of this. I mean, and that whale oil was the lamp oil, and we nearly, if it hadn't been, I really think that you can see the seam of history here. If it had not been for the discovery by some savvy humans of a alternative lamp oil, and keep in mind, lamp oil and lighting was the major use of an oil. I mean, we do not yet have the automobile. For transport power, we already have the steam engine. We did that in our last session. So you imagine a steampunk society in which lighting is, it's an increasingly mobile society that's able to build now big buildings, and we need lighting for it. And so the combination of oil lamps, and there was gas being used, but whale oil would have extinctified whales had we not invented this new product. Thoughts, Guy? I mean, on this historic import of this?
Well, it's just another example of humans will do anything for a little more comfort, for the ability to read at night, for the ability to have a lamp that shows around the corner. It's astonishing. It wasn't far into harvesting whales that we knew they were going to significantly decline in number. Didn't slow us down at all.
And whaling was not an easy, this was, it involved putting to sea at great risk. Storms could sink the ship. You could run aground. Life was really hard aboard this ship. Rudyard Kipling Captains Courageous, Moby Dick. You know, some of the great epic novels of struggle are written about this industry and its risks. And this is what we did. People were paid and employed to take these risks, as we saw with coal, where you could be, let's see, you could be suffocated, you could be crushed, you could be flooded and killed that way, you could be exploded by the methane gases in the coal mines, or you could simply be crushed by an ore car that started to move in the wrong direction. And people actually did this and had to do this for the owners of these kinds of industries on a grand scale, just to provide this fuel to us, to those who could afford it.
$1.50 was a lot of money in 1846.
A very much a lot of money. And again, lighting may have only been for those with the ability to afford it. Let's go to the next slide. Here's our happy middle class or upper middle class couple. She's knitting at night and he's smoking a giant meerschaum pipe and reading by kerosene lamp. And it's a beautiful kerosene lamp made of, I think, China. It's kind of like a Tiffany thing. And so just a reminder that before crude oil, interior lighting came from candles. I think even before that, there was pitch. So you know, pitch was dug up. It is the asphalt-like stuff on the surface, was used since ancient times as a torch. But again, hunting pitch and finding it was a challenge, and it was not as readily available. Making candles were more easy to store. Animal oils, we've gone through whale oil. You did have town gas and rock gas, so you start to have natural gas being used, derived mainly from coal at that point, because they were not yet drilling, as we saw, for oil. But let's go to the next slide. And then I found this from EIA, the Energy Information Agency, and they completely have effaced the history of whale oil. I guess it's indelicate and not politically correct, but we see in this chart that it seems that they're saying it went straight from wood with a little bit of coal to tons of coal during the steam age, and then the oil age with petroleum. They literally have suppressed the whale oil age from this chart. And the fact that in the US, and the US was the leading whaling country in the world during the whaling era. In New England and in Eastern Canada, the homes have whale watch, not whale watch, but widow's walks, where the wife of the captain would walk waiting for the whaling ships to be sighted on the horizon, because it was such a huge industry and so many men had to put to sea to do this industry, that you actually have forms of architecture that were based on looking to see when the whaling ships would come back.
Because it was so dangerous. It was so dangerous. They didn't know if they were coming back. So the future widow would be walking back and forth, looking, waiting for that ship to show up.
That's right. I mean, there were ships used obviously for shipping many other things, but whaling was such a huge industry. Completely erased from the history of the U.S. Energy Information Agency. I would just love them to update a chart and show, maybe it's just a thin sliver here of the energy consumption. I think this is done as kilojoules or something. It's not done in, it's done in BTUs or some standard energy unit, not in pounds or volumes. But in any case, we'll do more on all of the energy mix in future sessions. Let's go to the next slide. What have we seen? We've seen that a process in the late 1840s, early 1850s, and the first well is dug here in Pennsylvania, in Titusville. And I draw your attention to the picture of Edwin Drake, who is credited with digging the first well in this country. And he was also a refiner. He refined his product into kerosene, into lamp oil and kerosene. And you'll notice that it says Titusville, the map, and then creek. Oil Creek was it was quickly called Oil Creek, that flowed it's a small river that flows by Titusville. It's the Oil Creek area, and it's Venango County, Pennsylvania, for those that want to look at it. If you look at Pennsylvania, it's in the northwest corner of Pennsylvania, not quite where Pittsburgh is. It's kind of in the rural area west of Pittsburgh, but still on the east of Pittsburgh, but on the western end of the state of Pennsylvania. And that's where Titusville is, which is the site of the oil rush in this country. And oil was thought to only be in Pennsylvania at that time. What was Drake? He was a railroad conductor. He'd been a hotel clerk, and he'd been an agricultural worker. I guess that means he'd picked crops, and had learned. How did he come by the oil idea? He had heard that salt miners in Pennsylvania were upset that their salt mines were becoming contaminated with oil flowing freely from close to the surface. Now, you would wonder, why did the salt miners for them, the oil was just an irritating contaminant to the product that they were mining. But Mr. Drake saw that and said, the brain cells struggle to put it together. We need lamp oil. Oil's flowing out of the ground, and getting so much of it is making the salt miners upset, making their day a bit longer than it should otherwise be. Maybe I could actually dig or drill for oil and refine it. And so he did. And that is the first oil well in this country.
And that's the history of human discovery.
It really is. And
But
it's
something is irritating. It's getting in our way. And so then somebody studies it a little closer and discovers that, oh, it doesn't have to be in our way. It can be used to accelerate our lives in some way.
Indeed. And some of these inventions, as we've seen, the steam engine, invented for a very narrow purpose, that of accelerating, somehow automating and accelerating the process of removing water from coal mines, coal already being used at scale enough to warrant it becoming very difficult and irritating to have to move so much water out of a continually reflooding coal mine. Because that's what, when you dig a hole below a water table, you dig out, and then it quickly fills in with water almost as quickly as you can dig it. And so things get invented for weird shit reasons, or narrow purposes, or sort of happenstance circumstances. And this is kind of similar to that. So let us go to the next slide, and we will see exactly what it began to look like. So very quickly, within a year or two of Drake's well, this is what Venango County looked like. There is not a tree in sight. Every single thing has been cut down. Oil derricks are everywhere. Oil covers the earth. When they would find wells that would just spurt oil out, they had to run and get, I kid you not, if you read about this or listen to some of these other videos, there's reports they were running through town yelling for barrels, pots, bathtubs. They lined carts with canvas and filled carts with just oil. They did every kind of thing. The oil ran into Oil Creek in Titusville and turned it black continuously. So much oil was simply lost on the ground, and it resulted in an oil glut immediately. Let's go to the next slide.
You see, you said there was no trees in sight, but actually there's a lot of dead trees there.
There's a lot of dead trees. Yes, every stick had been chopped down, if not for the derricks themselves, then for the houses and sheds and shacks of the poor humans consigned to work this industry. Let's go to the next slide. The very structure of these early oil wells bears the same geometry that we see today. A beam that is has a Samson post at one end, a steam engine. And so let me just clarify that here, the coal-fired steam engine was critical to the extraction of oil at scale right from the start. One could not have happened really without the other. What do you think? Just think about that for a second. what is that? What are your thoughts on that? It's linked.
Yes, at least early on, coal was the master material. That's what was required to do any kind of extraction and distillation of other fossil fuels. But then it wasn't long after that that oil became the master material. Oil became the required material for powering the vehicles, for example, powering a whole lot of machines. These things are interconnected and have been pretty much since coal was discovered. The fossil fuels have all been linked.
I would I would put it even more strongly. If you had not had the coal-fired steam engine, the attempt to drill, to operate a rotating tool with any degree of the necessary speed and force and torque would have not worked. You would have had to imagine a drill bit being turned by a series of pulleys, either by a human or a set of donkeys or mules, um, and you would not have had that. The ability to chip away at a rock face prior to the steam engine being able to power an air compressed tool. You have a hammer and chisel by hand. That's has a certain power to it. But once you have a captive bolt with a tool on the end of it being run by compressed air with a valve that oscillates, that can allow that tool to smash forward and back several hundred times a minute, you have something that can go through rock more or less like butter, and or a drill bit that can rotate. You can have you might go through 20 drill bits a day. Doesn't matter. You're going after that oil, and you have a steam engine able to rotate or oscillate a tool at a rate that no human has ever been able to do before that. And so the advent of the steam engine enabled the oil extraction at scale right from the start. These things are related. They get used, one gets used for the other. So this distilling and refining, it's important to know that gasoline as a product, along with many other petroleum fractions, we'll talk about that later. You know, when you take this oil out of the ground, it's black, it's full of different compositions and impurities. It has, every oil field is different. Oil geologists love to try and characterize it almost like wine. It's sweet, it's bitter, it's sulfurous, it's whatever. It's not quite as pretentious as how people talk about wine, but it's as if they're tasting it and enjoying the taste or not enjoying the taste. And so Drake found that a product called gasoline, I think it's a much lighter fuel, was created, and he just discarded gasoline at this point. We do not have vehicles. There's no use for gasoline. It doesn't burn properly in an oil lamp. You need a heavier oil. So we are literally digging this shit out, refining it, and throwing away a large part of the hydrocarbons, and they're evaporating into the atmosphere from this point. So they are an emission, even though they don't get used and put in a car. They're an emission. Putting it in a car, Guy, would I be correct that actually burning it in a reasonably tuned car would be less of an emission in some way than simply letting it evaporate?
Yes, absolutely. And it would provide some service then. I mean, this is just throwing away fossil fuels, but not quite throwing away. It's throwing them away so that they evaporate into the atmosphere.
Indeed. And they had been captive underground. You know, the asshole department here would say, well, you know, there was oil seeping to the surface and it would have evaporated its volatile organic compounds. So, you know, without human intervention. Yes. But, you know, as we know, the asshole department always focuses on some small little factoid and tries to say that it's the equivalent of this level of human extraction and intervention in drilling out of the earth things that had been captured for 300 to 50 million years and liberating them all suddenly. It's not the same. Thoughts?
It's amazing what we'll do. I mean, it really is. Even when we're past the point of understanding the negative consequences, the things we'll do for increased personal privileges.
Indeed.
They're amazing.
this is the first of the dirty jobs. I mean, what is it? Mike Rowe, does wonderful series of dirty jobs. And if he were making his series back in the 1850s and 60s, he would spend several episodes on this filthy, dirty oil industry. And because it was the ultimate dirty job. I think coal mining was possibly dirtier and more dangerous. Let's go to the next slide. Yes, and so I've already gone through that. Power from coal-fired steam engines was critical to the oil extraction process. And steam engines were getting, if you remember from our previous episode, a steam engine was this giant Rube Goldberg machine. They're becoming much more professional and horizontal, and something that you could imagine, putting into a workshop. I mean, they were not just a giant structure out of doors. And so you have portable steam engines that were absolutely critical to the oil extraction right from its start. The other thing is the innovativeness that we had to do. I mean, we now think of today's fracking as a high-tech thing where explosives are used underground and water and other fluids are injected. The oil industry had all of these factors right from the beginning. Yes, some wells would gush right away, and you really didn't have to do anything beyond the initial drilling. You would get oil for quite some time. The wells would, of course, start to reduce in their volume because it was coming out under pressure. And once there was no more gas or pressurized oil, you had to then pump it out. You had to switch from controlling a gusher to pumping. But right from the start, you had this thing called a paraffin plug that would form because the friction of the oil starting to rush through the tip of the pipe into it would create some heat, and that would actually start to, the oil would start to change and form the paraffin, which is a thicker wax-like thing. It's literally part of the grade of most oil, crude oil. The paraffin would congeal around the tip of the oil drilling bit, where the oil was starting to surge towards the surface, and plug it up or slow it. Just slowing its flow was intolerable. And so various inventions, there was a whole industry, which we now call oil field service. Dick Cheney's company, I think it's called Halliburton.
Yes.
Care McGee, Kellogg, Brown and Root. These companies, if you look at their history, they are oil field services. So all sorts of inventions and services have to be invented for this oil industry. And one of them is we can go to the next slide, is gunpowder or nitroglycerin torpedoes or bombs, or it was called the Roberts torpedo. And they all patent these. They get patents for these. They become wealthy. And Roberts patents this torpedo, which is literally a long, thin stick of explosive that you put down to blow off the paraffin plug of your well, because slowing that yield is absolutely intolerable. Must keep flowing once you've got that investment. What are your thoughts on this?
Must go faster, must have more. That's the history of humans right there. And so anything that gets in our way of going faster, we got to get that out of the way.
Yeah. Again, another view of the Pennsylvania oil field where you can see the barrels. And so many other industries quickly were overwhelmed when you read about this. The oil flow, so many people surged in to dig their own wells. So we have this human capability that we follow something. I mean, it was an oil rush just like the gold rush. All sorts of people dropped what they were doing and said to their wife, I've just quit my job as a clerk at the local store. And the wife recoils in horror and says, "You did what?" And he says, "We're moving to Titusville, and I'm going to take all of our money, and so are my cronies, and we're going to dig a well there in oil country." And the wife would, in those days, probably just, she'd either kill herself on the spot or go with him and have to live in this environment here that we're looking at. Um, and so the cooperages, the creation of so much wood had to be chopped down for the cooperages that there were shortages of forest products and wood for other purposes. Transport. The Teamsters, apparently, I think the origin of the Teamsters Union is, it was not a union at that point, but the word Teamster meant wagon hauling teams of men who would haul wagons. And so many Teamsters were needed to haul the oil from the hillsides where it was being spurting out of the hill that they began to have influence as a class of people. And they were so highly paid. Some of the highest wages paid were actually paid to the Teamsters who would haul the oil, because if you couldn't get your oil to market off of the hillside, it was worthless. And you had all this cash that you'd put into the steam engines and all the tools and equipment and the staff. So it was an extremely chaotic and unprofessional kind of industry. It was ragtag. It was wildcatters. That's where the phrase comes from. It was every man for himself.
You've probably seen price per barrel for oil, and the barrel is expressed as BBL.
Right.
And early on, I wondered what that was. It's blue barrel. The blue barrels compensated for the amount of oil that would evaporate out of the barrel.
Mm,
Blue
right.
barrels were different. They filled it full, but then by the time it had arrived at its destination, it had evaporated a certain proportion of the oil out of it. So thus the expression BBL or blue barrel.
Uh-huh. Right. And a barrel, for those, a standard barrel today is 42 gallons. I didn't know that. And I don't know how they ended up on that number, but that's the number. And so you have oil markets in New York and Oil City and Titusville, Pennsylvania. You have by 1872, so just 12 years after it really started going big, you have oil reaches 6 million barrels a year and is the fourth largest export from the United States. Major capital starts to pay attention to it. The Mellons of the Mellon Bank and and we'll talk about Rockefeller later. But this becomes a huge industry, and as I say, there are specialized companies that spring up just and methods and tools that are tool makers that spring up just for the recovery of broken drill bits. There is a bunch of different inventions that are invented to go down and try and hook into it the tip of a broken drill bit in a well shaft and bring it back up. And you have people specialized in that. People would be contacted to travel to a certain well and fix it. And the amount of money that you would pay such a person to get your well back gushing, you just set your own price. I mean, how much is it worth to you? It's worth basically the output of this well for the next 5 years to get it to gush again. So very lucrative fields, not just hourly wage labor, but there's a degree to which in oil field services, why are these so lucrative? You can see is that you are offering a service that puts someone back in the business of basically printing money.
Again, humans will do anything for a little more privilege, regardless of what it does to other human beings.
Or the planet.
Right, absolutely. And that 42 gallons that's in a barrel, that's a blue barrel, and that's what they would put in there to accommodate the fact that a bunch of it is going to evaporate away. And I don't recall whether it was 40 gallons in a conventional barrel or 35, but it was some lower number. And the 42 is to compensate for the oil that's going to evaporate. Of course, it doesn't evaporate anymore, but we were stuck on that size of barrel.
Maybe that's why it's 42 and not it's 42 and it's going to be a guaranteed amount of 40. We don't know. And we don't know whether, should read up whether steel barrels, once they come in and they're airtight, was there less evaporation than the wooden barrels, because they were wooden to begin with?
Right. Exactly.
We don't know. Let's go to the next slide. And so remember, this is here just to remind us that in all of this environmental destruction, all of this activity, all of this strenuous drilling into the skin of the earth to extract this black fluid, almost regardless of whether it was needed, it quickly saturated the market. It's all just for home lighting oil, by and large. There's a few other purposes for what is being extracted at this point. But if you're talking about 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, even 1890s, the only use is to light lamps in your house. Other uses are starting to be invented, but pretty much it's for lighting fuels. Let's keep going. And it is from the very start a boom and bust business in which the sad and pathetic humans swarm in and dig so many wells and produce so much oil that its price goes below. Right from the start, it was a problem that so much oil would start to flow in the various wells and wildcatters that the price was fell to be so poor that you couldn't make money. You'd put out all this money to hire these people, get covered in oil, buy all this equipment, and you going to take your product to market. It fell from $20 a barrel initially to $1 a barrel. And if you look at somewhere, I think I might have a graph of the price of oil adjusted. It pretty much was down at the $1 or $2 or $3, maybe $4 for most of its early history, after having started as high as 20. This is inflation adjusted dollars. And here we have Venango County, where it all started. You can see where it is on the state of Pennsylvania. It's in that yellow there. I don't know if you can put the cursor there, Guy, but it's right there. That one county in the upper left there on the state is where you just see the edge of it in Venango County. It peaked at 31 million barrels in 1882. The oil wells peaked at 4,192 in 1880. And in 1882, the price per barrel dropped to 78 cents, less than $1 a barrel. So the oil had been being drilled out of there since, when was it? When was Drake? 1852? We could go back, but let's not go back. Let's just say it's 1852. Edwin Drake digs the first well there. He dies in 1880, penniless. He had lost all his money, because what happens is you are very financially successful. You plow all that money into other oil plays. I love the word play. It's used continuously by geologists and oil people. You plunge all your money into other investments. And yet, if the price has gone down that far, you're not able to sell or draw your oil and get it to market at a price that allows you to pay your workers, pay your costs, and pay yourself something. And so Edwin Drake dies penniless in 1980. In 1880. I just find that so poetic, Guy.
And the pattern continues today. Gail Taverberg, sometimes you find her online as Gail the Actuary, has displayed over and over that the price of oil goes up. That destroys demand. People buy less. The price of oil crashes. I think the maximum price is somewhere in the $142 range several years ago. It's just got this up and down going still today. So if you invested in oil when it was at $142, sounds like the kind of thing I'd do, then today you'd be dirt poor. You'd be the Edwin Drake of the modern day.
You would. And when the price goes up, and these days, and we'll be talking about this, when the price goes above 50 or 60, all sorts of oil plays, again, loving this term that they use, all sorts of oil plays actually swing into action, because it becomes profitable. It starts to become profitable now to do crazy things like fracking and all that high-tech explosives and in water injections you have to do for fracking or for harvesting oil from oil sands. That becomes profitable only today at about 50, 60, 70 a barrel. And so those things swing into action today. And but if it goes below that, then there's other oil that they go for. So today the industry is just able to flex between different types of plays and diversify across this. But in its first 30 years, this was not well understood. Let's keep going.
Well, I want to point out the second paragraph on the right-hand side, second sentence, pit hole city side, brutal, boom and bust. Pit hole city? You never would have guessed that would have turned out badly just based on the name alone.
Indeed. Pit hole, you can add an SH to the start of that and you'll see what it is. But poor old Pit Hole City in Pennsylvania had total bloom and bust. That's right. So along with this, one of the biggest industries, I mentioned oil field services, but obviously the biggest industry, aside from drilling the wells, is the refining. And notice that the first two names up here are named for the very state in which all of this is based. The two biggest refiners are Quaker State and Pennzoil from Pennsylvania. Many of these were started in Pennsylvania. Gulf Oil started in Texas. And that's where the oil ends up moving. It moves from the plays end up moving from Pennsylvania when it starts petering out to Indiana and Ohio and at that time then people said, well, Indiana, the Midwest and the New England are the only places where you'll find oil in this country. And the initial people who were digging around in Texas, people laughed at them until the next big gusher. The first gusher was in Titusville in Pennsylvania, but the Drake's Well. But the next big gusher is Spindletop in Texas, which gushes and creates a mile-long lake of oil before they can cap it. A mile-wide lake of oil. Now, a certain personality comes along about whom you have to sort of wait, drum roll, for when is this man going to enter the stage, and how does he enter the stage? Is he what are his talents, and how does he take control? Because he was not the first. He was not the first mover. He also was a produce merchant, shipping pork, salt, and wheat. This is John D. Rockefeller. He was made wealthy just as a produce merchant because he was a supplier to the Union Army in the Civil War. He had all of this capital. He had made himself a wealthy man. His strength was accounting and mathematical and financial analysis. And with this amount of capital in his pocket, he was looking around for a better industry than pork, salt, and wheat, than basically edible products or produce to make money on. And he analyzed this emerging refining business, not the drilling business, but the refining business for kerosene, which was exploding. And in 1965, he simply purchased a small refining company. By 1866, I think just 1 or 2 years later, I think it was in 1865 that he purchased it, he was already doing $2 million of business, which was a huge amount of money for Rockefeller kerosene. He had an unusual mind, very analytical, and he could see, that his suppliers were a feckless and hapless bunch of fools. No one else, it seemed, other than Rockefeller, could analyze this industry for what it was doing to people. He saw immediately that it was a boom and bust. I think he had learned something about that from the produce market, that when the supply of a certain product exceeds a demand, the price will go through the floor. And if you're not ready for that in some way, you'll be taken through the floor with it. He saw that all the things you need, be it teams of wagon haulers, transport, barrels, railroad cars, access to transport, and the refining process itself, that this needed, he needed to assure his own supply chains. And so he does what we call today vertical and horizontal integration. He buys and leases and makes sure he can control the supply of all of these things, which helps him succeed better than others who were just wildcatters. The people who think, I'm just going to drill a well and make a lot of money, or I'm just going to set up a refining company and refine and make some money, or I'm going to set up some oil field services and make some money. He Rockefeller took a much more diabolical, sophisticated attitude towards this stuff.
Yes, and that's critical. Again, it's as I mentioned Gail Taverberg, Gail the actuary, on social media, and these are the kind of people, her and John D. Rockefeller and others, who can look into the future and see what the rest of us are unable to see. Maybe they do that by understanding what's going on now and what has happened in recent history. But however they can make that work, it has turned out to make a lot of money for folks like Rockefeller.
Indeed. And we get to call these people today. Now the businessmen who've succeeded at getting basically everyone else to work for them, we call them the risk takers. We don't call the actual children who were sent down into the coal mines to be exploded, alternately exploded, suffocated, drowned, or crushed. We don't call them the risk takers. No, it's the owner of the coal mine or the oil drilling operation, the owner, who is the risk taker. Am I correct about that, Guy?
Yes, absolutely. And it's just what we do in this culture, in this society, this country, and extending to Western Europe as well.
I don't think we should tax these risk takers shouldn't have to pay any tax because they take all the risk. I
Right.
think the guy who's stupid enough to go down into the coal mine for a daily wage, well, that's who pays the income taxes and the highest tax rate in this country now. That's as it should be, isn't it, Guy?
Well, it's not that they're stupid enough, it's that they're desperate enough, because there are the owners, like the Rockefeller family, are uh, they're called the owners for a reason. You won't find them going into a well or participating in dangerous activities. That's for other people. That's for the little people. That's for the masses.
We have to be very careful. The Rockefellers of today have disvested themselves of this filthy, dirty, and dangerous industry. They have gone through that process in the last 20 years, and they are clean and washed of all connection with this. So we have to be very careful and incline the head in that direction. So how does Rockefeller do it? He's not a first mover, and what he does is he partners with he finds a useful partner named Henry Flagler, who was much more outgoing. Rockefeller was an absolute introvert, hated dealing with people. Flagler is much more of a salesman and a savvy person in terms of dealing with others. And they become a very successful partnership. And they saw immediately that to make their oil business succeed, they needed to control, well, an entire other industry called the railroads. Now, they weren't going to control this necessarily by owning the railroads, but they had to control them. And so they realized they had to negotiate superior shipping rates. And they were already becoming one of the largest refiners. And so, as the biggest refiner, they had the power to get the best shipping rates with the railroads, because they had the greatest volume, and to extract from the railroads a promise never to offer the same rate to any other refiner. This, today even, I think, would be illegal. But at the time, there was nothing really preventing them from doing this. And so they had the best rate for shipping the oil, as well as the control of much of the refining. And they could set the rate for purchasing the oil from the poor suckers who did all the risky work of drilling it out of the earth and so forth. And so by control, this is just one of about 15 or 20 ways in which they created the leverage that allowed them to destroy the competitor refineries. If you're a competitor refinery, a smaller operation, and you have to pay 30% more to get your oil to market, whether to bring it in to refine it, or to once it's refined into product to then ship it anywhere, if you have to pay even 5% more, you're at a disadvantage. 2% more, you're at a disadvantage. And so one by one, they all either went bankrupt or sold for bargain price to Standard Oil, to Rockefeller's company itself.
And we see the same pattern later, shortly after World War II. The timber industry, dominated by Weyerhaeuser, bought the railroads because they knew the railroads were important to shipping wood. And later Warren Buffett bought the railroads because he recognized during the so-called Great Recession that people were going to have difficulty shipping by any other means. So the railroads became very expensive and desirable again. But this is what wealthy people do is they look into the near future and understand what something that is about to happen, and they take advantage of
Indeed.
the industry and the rest of us.
And they're able to take much better advantage than any other person who might come to the same conclusion, because they have a starting position of already having $300 million or however many other. Whereas even if you came to the same conclusion and had the same wisdom, but you start with only $5 or $500,000, you can't do what that other person does that starts with all of that power and leverage to begin with.
Right.
The other entity that was dominating the railroads was the steel. At this time, the steel industry is also surging. Why is the steel? And I didn't have any slides on this, but it's very related. It's all surging together. Steel, the making of steel, in which coal is indispensable at this time. For the railroads, steel is needed, let's see, for the railroads, for the drill bits, for the track, for the rail cars, for everything that is needed to transport all of this new stuff, for the structural steel, for the buildings that are now being built in the cities higher than ever before in this period, to house all of the apartments and the department stores that will sell all of the new consumer goods that are enabled by the wealth that is created by all of the levels of all of this exploitation of fossil fuels. It's all happening at once in the from 1850s to the end of the 20th century. We modernize. It is the steam era and the beginnings of the oil era. It's a massive mobilization of society from farming from a purely agrarian, almost purely agrarian society to a urban and industrial society.
It's quite a transition that occurred in no small part because of what the Rockefeller family and especially John D. Rockefeller did in foreseeing where things were headed in this country and beyond.
I'm thinking of Andrew Carnegie, who cornered the steel business. He very similar techniques from what I remember reading about Carnegie to Rockefeller. I mean, it's a certain type of playbook that if you are enabled to do it and you simply do it, you can win. And you have to be in the right position. And Andrew Carnegie was in the right position to capitalize on and monopolize steel as an industry. And once you're that powerful, if your workers go on strike, you can make a case to the state government, the city, the county, the state, that they should send police to break up this trespassing and disturbance of these people. And in those days, the police didn't come; they came on horses with guns and clubs, and that's how they broke up strikes early on of workers who felt that, well, I'm working for this risk taker, but it seems like I'm taking most of the risk and I'm being paid. I just had half my body blown off in this blast furnace here, and I've been sent home with a bill for my torn uniform. It doesn't quite seem fair. And so, I mean, all of this is happening at that time, and the labor movement in America that became strong because of these abuses.
Unbelievable. And yet not. In retrospect, it all seems so obvious. But at the time, the ability of a handful of people to manipulate the system for their benefit was just remarkable. Same
That's
sort
why,
of behavior continues today.
right. And that's why I'm juxtaposing John D. Rockefeller with poor old Edwin Drake, the founder of the first drilling and refining operation. They're both refiners. So Edwin Drake started refining his own product and trying to do it all, and died penniless in 1880. Rockefeller comes a little later, and by 1879, the Standard Oil Company controlled 90% of all refining operations in the U.S. So a year later, Edwin Drake, I think it's 1880 or 1882, a year later, he is dead, penniless, and Rockefeller and his partners own 90% of all operations. And he started to see long before the Antitrust Act that broke up Standard Oil in 1908, I think. Rockefeller knew that what he was doing wasn't going to fly, and he took the step of organizing Standard Oil. There was already Standard Oil of Indiana, Standard Oil of Ohio, Standard Oil of New Jersey. I mean, all of these states where he created operations. Since at that time you chartered your business by state, and he realized that if Standard Oil of Pennsylvania was operating in Indiana, that wouldn't fly. So he created separate companies, and he made the Standard Oil Trust to hold the shares of all of these operating companies, and thus a single person could manage the Standard Oil Trust and make decisions for multiple separate companies that operated in each state. And if one company fell onto legal trouble in a state, then that company could fight that on its own. It wouldn't damage the rest of the trust or the companies. I mean, you have to know and think through how to take advantage of our legal system to protect yourself if you're this kind of a risk taker with this kind of an amount of money. Isn't that right?
Oh, and he knew, Rockefeller knew
Mm-hmm.
about all the risks and how to mitigate for them. It was amazing.
And you'd be a fool to do otherwise. We're not in this, as they say in the mafia movie, after all, we're not communists. So, just this chart is actually a terrible chart, but because it has to, two of its bars go way off to the right. 4,500 barrels in 1859 are produced in this country. 500,000 are produced a year later. And by 1862, just 3 years later, 3 million barrels, which is a red bar that you understand goes off to the right at least a foot. In 2021, it's nearly 90 million barrels, not per year. You realize the first red bars are per year. That's the annual. But per day, 90 million barrels of oil. I don't know if that's just U.S. or worldwide. It's a shitty chart, but it gives you just the scale of what we're doing, and what was already being done by 1862. 3 million barrels is a lot.
Consider the scale of our lives, the lives of the people listening that might have 2 to 5 people living in a household, and our scope is as large as the closest grocery store or the closest school or whatever. Nearly 90 million barrels per day. It's unfathomable. We can't even conceive of those large numbers, much less the value.
It's we go you go to the light switch in your home and you flick it and the light comes on. You go to the tap and you turn it and water comes out, whether hot or cold. You go a few blocks to a thing called a gas station, and gasoline, a highly purified, incredibly energy dense fuel, pours out of a hose into a tank in your vehicle, and you drive around with the equivalent power of, I think it's either 70 or 700 humans. A full tank of gas is the equivalent of 700 humans pulling a 2,000-pound sledge, which is what your car is, for several days. And you get to put that in with just a 16-gallon tank of gas. It's quite remarkable. And Guy, what happens when any human in North America or any developed country, when there is a brownout or blackout for even an hour, when the internet goes down for even 11 minutes. When the hot water heater gives out and you can't have hot water, or the water gives out, or the price of gasoline goes up from $3.50 to $4.50. What do we do?
Many communities just shut down. Many households just shut down. The clocks don't work anymore. The electronic, all the electronic devices we have, they fail to work. It's and people get very angry about it. I lived off grid a little more than a decade, and those are the kind of things that happens all the time when you're living off grid and you're sort of new at it, is the power goes out every now and then. Oh, I forgot to account for running two microwaves at the same time in two separate houses, that sort of thing. It's just too much power was required. Imagine comparing your life to somebody in the 1940s, 80 years ago. 80 years ago, people did not have access to the kinds of devices, the kinds of electronics, the kinds of technology that we have today. And they would have thought nothing of the power going out. It was just a minor inconvenience. When I was a kid, and I know this goes back a long way, we had candles and matches in the house because the power went out frequently. The electricity just stopped working frequently. And so we knew we were going to have to use the candles and the matches. People don't think about that sort of thing anymore.
When I was a kid, I was young enough that we grew up in an apartment. My parents had an apartment in a 4-unit apartment building in a major city. And in the basement, as a kid, I was fascinated. As a 6-year-old, I would go down into the basement where this apartment had to have a janitor. And this janitor serviced a number of apartments. And the janitor was this big, scary man who was always filthy. And the reason he was always filthy is that in the winter, weekly, every week, a giant dump truck came to the side of this apartment and through a chute into the basement, dumped an immense pile of coal, which made an immense noise and filled a whole room. And then you go down to the basement, and there was a coal burning furnace that heated a boiler that provided hot water to the radiators in all 4 apartments of this thing. It's how we got heat. And the way you regulated the heat was there was a valve on the radiator in each room, and there was heat and steam coursing through that thing. But if you didn't want the room to heat up, you had to close the valve, and it would get almost red hot. And I was fascinated. And in the basement, the coal chute had a sign on it that said, "Do not." The bin right in front of the coal furnace had a sign that said, "Do not allow this bin to become empty." And that's a classic sign from the coal age. And the janitor's job was to load in the winter. He had to come on a cold day in this northern city. The janitor would have to come at least once a day in winter, in the dead of winter, on the coldest days. Of course, I'm sure it doesn't get this cold. I know it doesn't get this cold any longer in that city. So if the janitor and this system were still alive, he'd be able to relax many days of the week. But in the dead of winter in 1968 or 9, he had to come. The problem arose is that the heat would start fading away, and my parents and the other residents of this household would start dialing for this janitor. Where is the janitor? And because he had to go from merely stoking this hopper one time a day to twice a day. And that meant he was making rounds to the apartments that he managed, probably very frenetically, and shoveling like mad from the giant pile of coal into the hopper in front of the coal-fired boiler to provide heat, which was his job in the winter. And it was probably very strenuous. And he was always in a foul mood. And now I understand it all. Janitors were not interested in small talk in those days.
You'd be in a foul mood too if that was your job.
I would. And I would be thinking, what is this brat child doing snooping around my coal hopper in the back. I would go down there and watch this thing because it was fascinating. The doors of this red hot coal fired um, boiler would open, and there'd be nothing but absolute red hot coal in there. And he would shovel more in and then go away. And he shoveled so much in to try and just a 4 or 6 hour interval before he had to come back and do it all again because the neighbors would be screaming that their heat is not sufficient. Um, and I guess I did not fully understand that until I was an adult, what it was all for. It just seemed fascinating, to a kid.
Right. Right. A lot of adults still don't understand.
No, they don't. And of course, this was a major northern city in the 60s. Um, I think we moved out of that apartment before its heating system was ripped out. That coal system was ripped out, as it was of nearly every home, an apartment in the 60s and 70s, and replaced by either an oil burner, and the easiest conversion of those old coal-fired boilers was to oil or natural gas. And so, yes, we got rid of filthy coal, but became dependent then on natural gas or oil to heat those homes and run those boilers, which were based on boiling water, boiling steam. And so, um, you know, those furnaces have gotten more efficient now, and have gone from being less than 50% efficient to, I think, the highest rated gas fired boilers are 81% efficient or something. And so we have modernized these heat sources, but in most cases have not eliminated the use of fossil fuels for our home heating. If it's electric, a lot of apartments were modified to electric, but the electric grid in most places depends on coal and natural gas for a large part.
And that's something a lot of people don't understand. They think electricity is nirvana, that it solves all your problems if you just have an electric car, an electric this, an electric that. That electricity comes from somewhere.
Yes, it does, and it doesn't come from butterfly kisses. Let's go to the next slide. We're almost through here, this stage here. So I want to draw the distinction that still, it's 1881. Rockefeller has monopolized 90% of the industry, as we've just said, of the oil industry. But guess what? Oil's main use is still just for lighting, home lighting, street lamps, and a few other things. There's starting to be some other uses of oil, but we really don't have a diversified use. Let's go to the next slide. The automobile. So two things happen late in the 19th century. One that I didn't have a slide on, I should have a slide on, which is the invention of the electric light bulb and its patenting by Thomas Edison. And that electric lighting looks to replace and completely marginalize almost the entire oil industry. So Rockefeller is probably sweating bullets at first because the light bulb comes along here. I'm just trying to find out in what age it comes along, but I think it's 1880 something or 90 something. Edison, the electric light comes in, and electrification is seen as much safer than oil lamps or candles for lighting, because you don't want fires in your home, and there were fires caused by oil lamps tipping over. And it looked like the electric industry was going to bring an end to the home oil for lighting, but to the rescue came the automobile industry based on internal combustion. But here's a profile of the automobile industry in 1900, where apparently the very few cars that existed were about 50% of them were by steam, and 25% had started to be from internal combustion engines of various types. And EV, 25% were EVs. A lot of people don't realize that.
Yes, most people think that the electric vehicle phenomenon started just a few years ago. And it started a long time ago, and then there was just a little gap.
Right. Yes, the year is 1879 that Edison is awarded the patent. Um, and so let us take a look at the next slide, which is kind of astonishing. This is in the year 1916. Electric car charging stations in Chicago.
Probably more in 1916 than there are today.
Well, I haven't had time to look at this, and I do not yet own an EV. Let's go to the next slide because I counted 66 are listed here. 66 charging stations. And for Chicago circa 1916, I think the population might have been 300,000, 400,000 of greater Chicago. We should look this up. So charging, I'm sure that there were more charging stations per capita in Chicago at that time than there are today. But I don't know. I shouldn't say I'm sure. I suspect. Commonwealth Edison Company's substations equipped for emergency electric vehicle charging. North side, west side, south side, central. What a story here.
Well, I guarantee you that everything we don't know and that we express that we don't know, I'll get at least a half a dozen email messages from
So
somebody who went
I don't
online.
have to do the research. Someone else is going to research this. What was the population of Chicago? How many charging stations in the same Cook County area, if it is the same area today as it was on this map? And per capita, were there more charging stations then or now? People need to know. A part of the reason for this, again, we need to not forget the concept of energy density. So a cord of wood has an energy density of 16 megajoules per kilogram. Coal, which is denser than wood, 24. But crude oil, never mind refined, has 44 megajoules per kilogram. And once you refine it into gasoline, it's even more than that. I wish I had the one for gasoline. The battle between an EV and gasoline in the early 1900s, it literally came down to how much energy density do you have, and is it worthwhile to create a machine that has heavy batteries that only takes you so far because the energy density of those early batteries was very poor. But you have this magical fluid now, gasoline, with a super high energy density. Energy density means that for just a gallon or two of it, you can go many, many miles. Um, and the vehicle's weight is much greater than the weight of its fuel. Whereas with an electric vehicle, in those days, the vehicle's weight was essentially almost the same as the weight of the battery. The batteries today still account for a vast percentage of the vehicle weight of a Tesla or any EV. So energy density is what dictated which fuel would predominate at the time. And steam, of course, with coal wouldn't even compare. So the Stanley Steamer was not originally a rug cleaning company. It was the name of the vehicle, one of the first automobiles, if you will. So that what happens now? So I said in 1900, the automobile industry had just started. The electric lighting was taking over. Electrification was taking over from lighting, but the internal combustion engine had started. But just between 1900 and 1918, we have the major world war and the advent of a whole nother industry. The auto industry starts, and the aviation industry, which uses internal combustion engines for propeller planes, would never mind, not even talking about jet engines yet. Jets do not come into play till after World War One. After World War II. 1918 is the end of World War One, and the World War One sees an explosion of the first mechanized machinery of war, tanks, planes, the first aerial aviation of an air force, and ships, massive amounts of ships for the navies and for transport. And Coal-fired steam had taken over from the age of sail, but you start to find coal steamships getting converted to bunker oil, which is one of the heaviest oils that is refined out of a barrel of crude oil. And so you have a huge expansion in industrial society, a huge expansion in the types of machines that this industrial society depends on and wants to use. This industrial society fights wars with each other. I don't actually think they fought it over any real territory. In World War One ends pretty much with I think the same countries having the same territories. I just, what are they fighting for at this point? And but the point of this image here is just the scope of the oil age and how many machines and demands that it creates.
World War One, like World War Two, generated an enormous change in technology, especially in mechanical technology with First World War, and with respect to electronic capabilities in the Second World War. So,
Indeed.
there was very little change, as you pointed out, in the First World War in the boundaries of countries and that sort of thing. But the consequences were enormous as a result of the effort that went into creating machines, more efficient machines in the First World War, and into creating technology in the Second World War. So they really did change the nature of the world and our relationship with the natural world, mostly for the bad in the case of the latter.
And the we end here. Let's go to the next slide and see where we're at. This is where we end for today. I'm returning to this slide. I will be periodically. Hydrocarbon man. We're telling the story of how we became hydrocarbon man, Homo carbonicus, Homo detritovorus, because we are literally everything we do and eat, in the sense that all of our food is produced dependent now on the detritus that we are consuming from ancient dead life forms, 50 million to 300 million years old, that we are now very accomplished at digging out of the skin of Mother Earth on a scale and with a degree of professionalism and smugness that is unmatched. And this age, there's two possibilities. We imagine that it will continue like this forever. That is our bias for normalcy. We are completely socialized into this industry. Even a child at age 6 expects the gasoline to flow from the end of a gas tank as he or she watches their parent fill the car with gasoline. It's as natural as turning on the faucet. Expects the electricity and the electrons to keep the lights on in the home, and the natural gas and other substances to keep going. The home that goes all electric can feel smug that they are using, I guess they feel that they're using a low emission or zero emission fuel. People who get an electric car get to feel like they're using they call it a zero emission vehicle, even though it must be mined, and the steel and aluminum that it's made of must be somehow gotten somehow. And this is our story. We will have some post-carbon future, either because we run out of this stuff or it becomes unobtainable at a reasonable price, or because we decide to, if we decide to move away from it and we succeed in doing that, then we might have a post-carbon zero emission civilization. Those are in heavy quotation marks because we will critique those notions. But this is where we are, and we've only told part of the story of the age of hydrocarbon man.
I vacillate between discouragement and disgust and occasionally optimism. at what we have done in such a short period of time as Homo carbonicus, as living off the energy that comes from dead plants and animals.
We're so good at it. We could be so good at so many things if we. It's sort of proof that if we just put our minds to things, we can do them. Um, but will we all put our minds to really changing how we conduct ourselves? We changed so much from the pre-hydrocarbon age. Um, all of this hydrocarbon usage necessitated massive change, which we seem to do. I spoke of the guys during the oil rush who just would up and leave their perfectly decent living doing something that they were doing and announced to their families that they were going to move to this filthy part of Pennsylvania. That's change, you know.
Yes. Huge change.
Indeed. And many of them lost everything and then had to reinvent themselves in some other thing or die.
Right. Well, they all died. It's been a while.
They all died. That's true. But maybe they I mean the human story, either being a risk taker and going to selling everything and going to the hills of Pennsylvania to cover yourself in oil and risk your family's life, your and your family's life in that field with whatever fortunes await, um, or to go aboard a whaling vessel and try and wrestle these and kill these giant animals and bring home their oil and not get, let's see, scurvy, yellow fever, typhus, um, some injury or impalement. And there was no antibiotics. You would simply be one of the people who's brought aboard, who's buried at sea, and um, your few effects are presented to your widow because you somehow festered some boil you got while whaling festered and killed you, and you were disposed of at sea. Um, these were risky endeavors.
And those who took those risks back in those days, the analog was going to World War I or World War II. It's a very high likelihood that you're not going to come back, that you're going to be killed in the process.
So we risk everything to get these fossil fuels to burn them, and we create a society that then layers other risks on top of it. But people don't want to give it up. So,
And I think that's a fine place to stop. I think that's as depressing as we can possibly get.
I don't find it depressing. It's just really understanding a little more deeply how we have gotten to where we are, and it makes it less terrifying in some sense. But maybe that's just me.
Well, it's nice to have explanations for how we got here. And one of the things that I've been trying to impress upon people for a long time is that it's not your fault as an individual. These things that have happened over the course of the last 50 and 100 and 200 and 1,000 years have created the conditions that we are living in today. Your ability to choose between an electric vehicle and an internal combustion engine powered vehicle, these are not they're big decisions in terms of our personal lives, but this figure that we're looking at right now, we didn't drive us there,
No,
right? This was not you and me and 8 billion other people who drove us to the human mastery of fossil hydrocarbons.
we were born into this age at the time we were born into. I remember looking up uh, the carbon CO2 in the atmosphere was at 319 in the year we were born, Dr. Guy,
Mhm.
and it is now at 419. I think literally 100 parts per million more than when we were born, and um, the it took, I think, 600,000 years before we were born for the carbon to go from 219 to 319. So carbon in the atmosphere has gone another 100 parts per million just in the 64 years since we were born. And it previously took, I think, 300,000 years or something to go from 219 to 319. So that's impressive.
Impressive and depressing simultaneously.
Yes. But with
Absolutely.
that, we should conclude today's episode and look forward to next week where we continue this story, because we're really only at 1918, 1920, after World War II. Sorry, after World War I. And there is a lot more of the story to tell to bring us to the present moment.
Yes, there certainly is. Looking forward to it.
All right.